You know, there are some perks to having two services. One of them is you get to hear the special music twice. Thank you so much. Laughing is a funny thing. Some people find laughter in all kinds of places, and we laugh for different reasons. For instance, we laugh because things are humorous. This is one of those belly laughs when you hear something that's funny to you and you go, it's humorous, and the more you think about it, the more funny it is. But laughter is very subjective, and so is humor. I read a story on the internet this week. I thought it was just absolutely hilarious. I read it to my wife. Now, the good thing is that since my daughter got married, my new son-in-law, it's been 3 years now, but my son-in-law has the exact same humor I have. So now I have company. And my wife and my daughter just roll their eyes. And my daughter says, yes, I did marry my daddy when it comes to humor. It's good. We also laugh for other reasons. Sometimes we laugh because we don't know what else to do. You call it a nervous laugh. Someone asks you a question, or somebody asks you a question you don't really want to answer, or you hear something and you just, I don't know about that. It's kind of that nervous thing. And then there's what I call the cynical laugh. Yeah, right, yeah. We use them at various points in time. Now, very early in my life, I kind of thought I was a funny person, and then my wife told me I wasn't. And so I've learned through the years not to try to be too funny, and usually it's when I'm humorous, or when I'm not trying to be humorous, that I am the most humorous. For years, we would meet with one of my wife's best friends. Her name is Becky. And whenever I told a joke, Becky would always laugh. I thought she was one of my best fans. Then years later, I found out that when I tell a joke, Becky doesn't laugh at my joke. Becky looks at my wife and sees the look on my wife's face, and she's laughing about the look on my wife's face. And I discovered many years ago that it's sad when you realize that the people you thought were laughing with you are actually laughing at you. Well, here's a story I want to share with you this morning about laughter. And we'll see which kind of laughter you think it was about this woman. The title of this sermon, since it's not in the bulletin, is The Woman Who Laughed at God. She was an old woman, and she kept turning over the events of the last few hours, because one would have to argue whether it is polite to laugh at God. It is not. And yet it was so ludicrous to think that she, a 90-year-old woman, could have a baby. It's crazy. She'd always wanted a son. If she'd had a son, it would have made her life complete. But she had always been unable to conceive through all the years that she and her husband had been married. And now at 90 years old, she'd gone through menopause many years before. Can I say menopause from the pulpit? Guess I just did, right? She'd gone through the change of life, and there was no more hope of a child anymore. None whatsoever. And then this stranger that is outside her tent has the audacity to rub it in her wounds and say she's going to have a baby? Ridiculous. A son? Ridiculous. She and her husband Abraham had been trying for many years and yet had never been able to conceive. Earlier in the day, 3 strangers had come by the tent of Abraham and Sarah, and there was no more hospitable tent in all of Israel than the tent of Abraham. And so quickly they invited them to come in and tarry for a while to get something to drink, and they went out and prepared a meal for the strangers, and they sat in the shade and they ate. It was not proper for a woman to eat with the men, especially strange men. And so Sarah was not at the table, but she was in the tent nearby listening to the conversation. And she hears this strange question from a stranger. He says, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" How does he know my name? How does the stranger know who she is? And then he says something even stranger in Genesis chapter 18, verse 10. Genesis chapter 18, verse 10. It says, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And then the next phrase comes, "I will surely return to you in the spring, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Verse 11, it says, "Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women." That's why I say she'd gone through menopause. It had ceased to be with her as it was with women. This was ludicrous. It was crazy. That's when she left. Can you blame her? I mean, if one of our... I've been struggling with how to put this. More mature women would come into church one Sabbath morning, one of those women with gray hair, or hair that should be gray, it's just not. Only her hairdresser knows for sure. One of those women that have reached that mature age of 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 and came in and said, "Pastor, I'm pregnant." I'd laugh. Wouldn't you? And so here's the stranger that says to Sarah, who has gone through menopause, she's long past the age of even hoping. And the stranger says, "Sarah's going to have a baby next year." And she laughed. Do you blame her? Now, I always kind of thought that probably from the tent nearby the table, the stranger heard a But in actual fact, I just learned this as I was reminded myself of this as I was studying for this sermon. It says in verse 12, "So Sarah laughed to herself." I don't think it was an audible laugh. I think she kept it in and she laughed to herself. And I think it was, yeah, right. She laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure or joy?" But then it continues. It says, Sarah laughed, verse 13, "And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I bear a child now that I am old?'" And then this phrase, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Who was this stranger? This is the first time Sarah realizes who this stranger is. This stranger is the Lord. The Bible talks about entertaining angels unawares. Well, Abraham and Sarah were entertaining the Lord unaware. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Now, for 25 years, Sarah would have been saying, no, it's not. Because God had promised Sarah a baby 25 years before. 25 years. She and Abraham, and probably long before that, but 25 years before this promise that had come, where God had promised to make a great nation of Abraham for 25 long years, they had been waiting. And when God had first made this promise, the answer that Sarah would have given, is anything too hard for the Lord? The answer that Sarah would have given was no. But at 90 years old, is anything too hard for the Lord? Maybe. And so she laughed. How long does one wait on God to fulfill his promise? This sermon is connected with a sermon I preached a couple weeks ago where I asked a question similar to it when I talked about how God works and about that God is faithful. Even when it seems like he's not faithful, God is faithful. How long does one wait on God to fulfill his promise? For 25 years, Sarah was thinking in her mind, they'd been following the Lord. 25 years before, she was 65, Abraham was 75. God had called them to leave their land and to go and to come to the land of Canaan. And God had given this promise back in Genesis chapter 12. We read it in the scripture reading. It says, then the Lord said to Abram, go from your city and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Quite a promise to make to a man who doesn't have children. And so God promises this promise. I will make you a great nation. And for 25 years, Abraham and Sarah had been waiting on God to deliver on his promise. For 10 years they had waited from the initial promise. For 10 years they had waited and still no baby. And so they got it in their mind that maybe they needed to give God a little help. Always a dangerous thing. They needed to give God a little help. And so you remember what happened. Sarah sent her handmaiden Hagar into Abraham, and they conceived a child. Remember, his name was Ishmael. It was nothing but problems from the very beginning. Because Hagar copped an attitude, as we would say, and began to cause trouble in the camp until finally God had to tell Abraham to have them leave the camp. This was a son of Abraham, but it was not the son of Abraham. And Sarah was still fruitless. 15 more years had passed, and now God has the audacity to say that she's going to have a baby? Ridiculous. Is anything too hard for God? Well, maybe. Why hadn't God given his promise when she was in the days of her youth and fertility, in the days of energy and childbearing? Not only do I find it hard to understand how a woman who is 90 years old would have a baby, I find it difficult to think about how a woman who's 100 years old would chase a 10-year-old. I mean, it's just crazy to think that she would have this child in her old age. And so Sarah laughed, and I don't blame her. How long does one wait on God to fulfill his promise? I've wondered that in my own personal life. Perhaps you've wondered that too. I don't want it to sound like a faithless wondering, but sometimes I've wondered, how long does one wait on God? Perhaps sometimes it might have seemed that God hasn't been as faithful as you thought he might in your life. And so how long does one wait on God? And how does God determine his timing? I can't answer all those questions, but I want to tell you a story about something that happened to me very early in my ministry, very early in my life, very early in my married life, that gave me a hint of what it means to remain faithful even when you can't see what God's doing. When my wife and I first started in ministry, we were in Indiana. And my first district in Indiana was in extreme southwestern Indiana, not far from Evansville, Indiana. And I lived in a town called Holland, Indiana. I told someone I was in Indiana, and I was holding a series of lectures, and I introduced myself as being from Holland. And the guy thought I was from Europe. I don't talk like that. So I lived in Holland, Indiana. My wife and I bought our first house in Holland, Indiana. It was this great little A-frame out in the woods on 5 acres. I just loved the setting. It was unfinished, so we could afford it, and I finished the house. I actually finished the house just in time to sell it. It's one of those things. So Candace and I lived on this setting for 2 years. We were working on the house all the time as we could afford it. And then one day the conference brethren met and decided that we needed to move. Now, I said, no, I don't want to move. And the conference brethren, in their wisdom, said, no, we need you to move to Terre Haute, Indiana. And so we put our home on the market, and we moved to Terre Haute, Indiana. And you know how it is when you put a house on the market. Many of you have done it. The first few days, people start watching, people start looking at it, and people are interested in it. But after the first initial couple weeks, then it kind of falls off. And we were way out in the country in southern Indiana, a place where I would have believed everybody would like to live. But there weren't that many people interested. And the conference had an interesting policy that if they ask you to move somewhere and you move somewhere, they will pay you what's called duplicate housing for 6 months. Because you're paying rent there, you're paying a mortgage here. They'll give you duplicate housing for 6 months. Not a problem. I was sure that this great little A-frame out in the woods would sell easily in a few months. And 6 months went by, and it didn't. And my duplicate housing ran out. And so I was paying rent, and I was paying house, and things were not equaling out. Finally, after 1 full year, I had reached the end. I had credit cards, and I had used them as much as I dared. I had stayed current with my mortgage. Actually was blessed that for a few of those months, I had a church member who was in Florida, and she let me live in her house rent-free for a few months. But it still hadn't sold. And finally, the very month that I could no longer pay for the house, the very month that I would have not been able to give my house payment, the house sold. And of course, in those days, everyone counted on, at least pastors did, pastors counted on selling houses to make a little extra money. Well, by the time I paid all my debts off and paid everything off, I broke even, which I was pretty happy about. But I just broke even. And I learned a valuable lesson from this experience. The question is, how long does one wait on God? And in my own case, I'm convinced that he had to bring me to the point of total surrender. Because when I knew that I wasn't going to be able to pay my payments that month, I wasn't frantic. I was just surrendered to God. He'll take care of this. He'll do it. And if we can't pay it, then he'll take care of it somehow. And in that very month, I finally had to come to the place where I came to total surrender. But there's also something else that I think I learned from this experience. And that is that sometimes God has to bring us to the place where we admit that we are totally helpless to do anything about it, so he can do something about it. It's like this. Sometimes we have God-sized problems that require God-sized solutions. And the problems are such that we cannot control them. We cannot answer them. We can't do anything about them. And so when the problem is answered, we have to recognize it as a God-sized answer, because there's nothing we could have done to take care of it. Don't we sometimes, I think we sometimes are a little bit greedy. We want to take the credit for certain things. Some of you might remember a few years ago, I told a story for children's story about something that had happened that morning on my way to church. I was on my way to church that Sabbath morning, driving an old teal-colored Ford I used to own. I'm sorry, it was a Buick. Not that you cared. I was on my way to church, and I was running a few minutes late. and I was on Highway 66 coming out of Smithsburg, right by the AC&T store. And when you get on that highway, on that road, there are only 3 very small, short patches where you can pass on that road. And I know where all 3 of them are. Because there's nothing as frustrating as getting behind someone going slow, the speed limit, on that road. And so I got on the road, and I was coming up to the first place where I could pass, and there was this big, huge cube van in front of me, and I knew I was not going to follow this cube van all the way to 70. And so I came to the place to pass. I looked. I got in the left-hand lane. I punched the carburetor to kick in, and just as I got into that lane, someone from a cross street turned into my lane, coming straight at me. I had gone into that lane just as they had turned into the lane, and it's like, hello. So I punched on my brakes and got behind the cube van again and just barely missed hitting this person head on. And I thought to myself, boy, it's a good thing I'm such a good driver. It's not what I thought. But don't we sometimes want to take a little credit? I'm a good driver. But that's a God thing. You know, I know God protected me that day. But don't we sometimes want to take a little bit of credit? Here's a story about Abraham and Sarah. There is no way that when Sarah got pregnant, Abraham could have puffed his chest out and said, boy, am I virile. No. As a matter of fact, he thought the whole thing was ludicrous too. Look back at Genesis chapter 17 for just a second. This must have happened just months before this episode with the strangers at the tent. Genesis 17, verse number 16. God comes to Abraham and talks about Sarah. Verse 16, he says, I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Verse 17, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Abraham does the same thing Sarah did. Any of you text? Sometimes you see the abbreviation ROFL. That's what Abraham did. Rolling on the floor laughing. God says Sarah's going to have a baby. And Abraham says, God, have you seen her lately? Of course, what's funny to me is when God promises the baby over in Genesis 18, Sarah says, have you seen Abraham lately? I don't know. They both kind of like, God, he's not able, she's not able. But Abraham laughed. Sarah laughed. There's no way possible. And I think this is the point of the story. There's no way possible, humanly possible, that God, or that Abraham and Sarah could have had a baby short of God. And sometimes God has to bring us to the place where it's only Him that could do it. And we have to acknowledge that. Well, you know the rest of the story. God finally did deliver, or perhaps I should say Sarah delivered. And she had her baby boy at the age of 90 plus. And she laughed again. Genesis chapter 21. Genesis chapter 21. It says, and the Lord, verse 1, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. The word Isaac, the name Isaac, is a very interesting name. You know, in biblical times, all names had other meanings. You know, it's a name, but the word had other meanings, physical meanings. And the name Isaac means laughter. I think that's so cool. That Sarah laughs at God, and, so to speak, God gets the last laugh. Because she names her son Laughter. And every time she calls his name for the rest of his life, she's reminded of her joy and her laughter. He's the boy. He's the laughter boy. He brought joy to her heart. Verse 4, it says, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Take the word out, laughter, and put Isaac in. God has made Isaac for me, you see. It means laughter. God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have thunk it? Oh, I'm sorry, that's not what it says. She says, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would suckle children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Laughter. She laughed at him once, but she got laughter. She got Isaac. Sometimes I ask myself the question, how long does one wait on God? How long does one wait on God? And at least one thing that I learned from this story is that God-sized problems require God-sized answers. And God is still in the business of providing those answers. Well, let's sing as we close. I told you I chose different hymns, so we're going to sing number 516. The first and last verse of number 516, all the way